Hello, my name is Alexis Edwards. I hold a bachelor's degree with majors both in English and philosophy, obtained at Thompson Rivers University in Kamloops, British Columbia. I am originally from Squamish First Nation, also known as Pavilion in British Columbia. My paper is called Aesthetics of a Culture, a discussion on the preservation of a culture through art. In this paper, I discuss how creativity and self-expression have always been essential to our humanity, and its objective is to show how through art in its various forms, Indigenous people can continue to preserve their cultural identity. Although there are indigenous cultures throughout the world, my research is limited to the indigenous peoples of North America, mainly the Northwest. It is through their artistic abilities that indigenous people express their culture, identity, and connection to the land upon which they rely for survival. Indigenous societies have used various forms of art to keep their culture alive, such as storytelling, architecture, tattoos and face painting, and the traditional dance. Each of these forms can be witnessed at various events held by indigenous communities across North America. Some of these events are called powwows and are for people to meet and socialize and to express themselves through song and dance. Most importantly, they are places to practice their culture and to strengthen its elements. I will be addressing the question of how these various forms of creativity and self-expression serve to preserve Indigenous cultural identity. I argue that through these artistic forms, a culture can survive and be strengthened. This paper expands the range of knowledge and understanding we have around the aesthetics of an Indigenous culture. Before European contact, Indigenous tribes remembered the past by way of storytelling. By word of mouth, stories containing history or valuable lessons are passed on through generations. Today, Indigenous cultures continue to share their stories and include expression through song and even dance. One of the most familiar ways of sharing stories through song and dance amongst diverse Indigenous nations is with a celebration of Native American culture known as a powwow. At a powwow, natives gather for the purpose of singing and dancing to honor the traditions their ancestors fought so hard to keep alive. Although the modern concept of powwow has its primary origins in European influence, mainly the exhibition and performance aspects, similar gatherings existed amongst tribal communities preceding the advent of European invasion. Such occasions including cultural ceremonies, successful war party homecoming celebrations, and alliances between tribes would include dancing and singing, a sharing of stories, and a feast. This modern expression of Indigenous culture continues to be seen as a display of art among the non-familiar population. By sharing their cultures through these forms of art, Indigenous groups can strengthen their cultural identities. Another valuable way for people to learn about their past and culture is by examining the architecture of their past. Buildings fortunate enough to survive through time and to be viewed beside contemporary architecture built for the same purposes can then be seen as historical pieces of culture where tourists flock to visit, giving such buildings emblematic status in the cities in which they stand. Apart from the 12th century cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde, now preserved and protected within the Mesa Verde National Park in Colorado, the indigenous people of North America do not have very many ancient architecture sites remaining today as tourist destinations. This does not mean that indigenous people failed to have building traditions that would be considered aesthetic heritage. Before European arrival, the indigenous peoples of North America's various cultural regions, defined by their climatic, geographical, and ecological characteristics, had distinctive forms of housing that reflected the conditions of the respective regions. There are many different types of indigenous homes, but one of the most well-known to non-indigenous people is the teepee. Traditionally made of animal skins wrapped around a wooden pole structure, some teepees were even painted to depict noteworthy experiences such as a historical battle, or a dream, or a vision. Today, teepees retain cultural significance and are sometimes constructed for special functions and are also prominent tourist attractions. In response to the need for a sedentary rather than nomadic way of life, the longhouse, pit house, and plank house are examples of more permanent building forms. Of the permanent housing structures of indigenous people, pre-European influence, one of the most visually exquisite is the plank house, found on the northwestern coast. The houses express the ancestral heritage and social standing of the owners through elaborate imagery with vastly decorated house fronts and brightly painted carved heraldic poles. These totem poles were to represent and commemorate ancestry, through crest animals, marking a family's lineage. Such architectural designs can be seen in many museums today, indicating that there is a great deal of aesthetic value to the traditional homes of the indigenous peoples. Art as communication and self-expression can also involve the use of one's own human body as a canvas. Most tattoo canvases you see walking around your local shopping center are purely decorative or pictorial. Tattoos can also be used as a form of identification. Sailors had their bodies tattooed so that in the event of a shipwreck, their bodies could be identified. Tattoos can also be purely symbolic. Tattoos can be symbols of changes and rites of passages, transitions the wearer has outgrown. They can represent growth, or they can be seen as scars of the process of change. In tattoo culture, tattoos, much like paintings on canvas, can provide emotional healing. As one would expect, tattoos held meaning for indigenous people as well, varying depending on the tribe. Some warriors of a tribe would receive a tattoo upon returning from a battle, where other tribes' warriors would tattoo themselves to mark how many kills they had. Females would often have tattoos signifying defining moments in their life, such as arrival into womanhood. This mobile symbolic form of self-identification and expression continues to be a popular art form in modern culture. Although tattoos now may hold less meaning than they once did, they still represent expression and identity for the bearer. In a less permanent form of expression, indigenous people would paint their faces for various reasons. Before engaging in battle with an enemy, a warrior would paint their face with protective designs, and prayers would be said during application. These prayers would protect the wearer. Today, powwow dancers paint their faces before dancing. Although some may do it just for the aesthetic pleasure of looking good for onlookers, some dancers dance with face paint either to protect themselves or perhaps to honor a family or clan's design. Over the years, artifacts that were illegitimately confiscated by government officials have ended up in museums. Of these objects, sacred dancing masks are easily found in museums. The ceremonial masks of the Northwest Coast depict various beings such as animals, humans, and even supernatural beings. Masks are used at elaborately staged theatrical events to tell stories of the past while validating the honorable history of the family who owns the mask. Masks across First Nations of the Northwest Coast are all different and vary widely in their purposes and stories. This expression of acting out a story in the form of a dance has carried over into the modern Indigenous world. In powwow gatherings, immense traditional dance is arguably one of the most popular dances. Due to the size of North America and the vast number of different tribes, the dance itself varies based on region. But most of the dances we see at powwows can trace their roots to established traditions of the Northern Plains. Most closely associated with 19th century warrior society dances, these warrior dances were even being performed among the people before the forced advent of reservations. After a battle, warriors would return to their village and reenact their conflict through expressive motions to the elders, women, and children of the village. These dances were not always related to war. Sometimes, after a successful hunt, the dancers would act out the story of how they tracked their prey, often imitating an animal like a buffalo or a horse or a bird. These expressive reenactments were carried over through generational sharing and have become standardized in powwows today. Understanding the origins of a culture and its art can help us understand the arts in modern society. Learning how and why an artistic creation came to be is important in developing a deeper understanding of and respect for the people and their culture. It is worth acknowledging that the forms of expression discussed in this paper are forms we still see in modern Indigenous society. Forms of art that have been with the Indigenous people before European arrival have survived despite the hardships endured, in part due to the sharing of culture at a powwow. Anybody who attends a powwow, Indigenous or not, can experience the songs and the dance regalia, the teepees, and all the other forms of expression discussed herein. Anybody who lacks the knowledge or experience of their own culture would benefit greatly by attending a function where their culture is shared. When we hear the sound of a drum, we are hearing the soul of the drum as it calls to us, inviting us to preserve and celebrate our traditions. For those interested, here's my list of references used out throughout this paper. I would also like to take this time to thank the organizers of the Indigenous Knowledge Symposium for providing me with this opportunity, and to also thank those who have come to listen today. Thank you.